right, so it is my pleasure to introduce to you Abby O'Connor and Benny Chan from the College of New Jersey. This is our 15th SliThEr, and I was happy to see lots of people registered for this one, and a lot of people are here. We have 30 people online right now, which is a big group for our SliThErs. So we're really happy to have you guys, and you guys brought in a really big crowd, so that's awesome. So without me blathering on and on, I will let you guys have at it and tell us about inclusivity in inorganic chemistry.
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction, Karen. My name is Benny, and I'm going to kick off our talk. And then we also have Abby here. So here's a couple of pictures of us and our kinds of families and out doing some interesting things out there. So it's been a lot of fun working on these kinds of projects. And it's great to have Abby as a colleague at TNJ. So first of all, I want to think about change. Change is hard. Change is really hard. Personal change is really hard, but trying to get a whole group of people to change is even harder. So this is where we are working towards at the College of New Jersey, is we're trying to think about theories of change. So theories of change is kind of a buzzword. If you do anything with NSF right now in their DUE, they're thinking about theories of change. It's actually acknowledging how complex the change process actually is. So how do we change our students? How do we change our faculty? And I think it really acknowledges the fact that as scientists, we're used to just having one variable, changing it one at a time, getting a result. But when you have systems that are so complicated, changing one thing may not lead to any difference in there. So it becomes very complicated. But we've been working on this kind of this inclusive excellence for about over 10 years now. So it's been a long time, and we've been able to put a theory behind the kind of change that we are seeing here. So we're going to demonstrate our theory of change and how we put it into practice. So a lot of this work, and I probably don't need to talk about this too much, but we see this kind of data all the time. There's a lot of students that really want a degree in natural science, and they can't actually get it. But if we break down the racial issues, we can see that, so this is from data from 2016, the US National Science Board. So these are students who wanted to major in a natural science degree and who actually achieved that degree. So these are the number of students that do not get the degree. So for white students, it's about 1.7% on here. If we look at the Asian students, the Asian group is actually very complicated if you actually dive into the data quite a bit, but it ticks up a little bit. So 7% of the students don't get the natural science degrees that they want. But once we start to hit the Latinx community, we see that it jumps quite a bit. And if you hit the Black communities, it jumps even more. So this kind of data is very common to see on a national kind of level. Now, like most people at our different academic institution, we always think, oh, this is national data. This doesn't happen in my school, and it certainly doesn't happen in my classrooms because I'm not that kind of person. Well, I'm sorry to say, but it probably does. So we have to take a very close look at what happens in our classrooms and our schools. And we found it's very useful to look at your own data. So we look at TC&J data, and we see that if we look at DFW rates, so students that receive a DF or withdrawal from a class, our data mirrors that national data almost perfectly. So our Black and Latinx students are getting Ds, Fs, and Ws at much higher rates than our white and Asian students on here. And this same thing is reflected in our personal classrooms, and I can show you some data about that. So we found that there's a problem in here, and one of the things that we've really strived to do is reach across boundaries and work with other people that are better at looking at these kinds of issues because they have a different set of tools to look at people. So we work closely with Dr. Lynn Gaisley from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And her postdoc was actually looking at why biomedical PhD students succeed and fail in graduate school. And she and I had some conversations about what she was seeing, and I was seeing the same things happening at TC&J with our undergraduate students. Her background is actually in qualitative research, so doing lots of interviews and trying to get trends and stories out of her study groups. So this is our undergraduate research group from a couple of years ago, and we work with her very closely in asking these kinds of questions. So one of the questions we ask is like, you know, TC&J is a predominantly white institution. I have maybe one or two students in my classroom, and as the data shows, you know, they're typically not doing so well. The first question I ask is like, well, come and see me for help. Come to my office hours, we'll talk about it, and we'll see what we can do to help. But they never come, all right? So I'm begging them to come, but they never come. But through the qualitative research, we start to get stories that sound like this. So this is a Black male. You don't want to be that one person that always has a problem, especially here. And he's referring to TC&J, because I'm African American. So I just keep mouth shut. All right. So what this is actually telling us in here, if we look at the broader quote and the context of this quote, the student has a lot of stuff that they're dealing with. And they don't want, if they're having an issue with a group, they're having an issue with a problem, they don't always want to be the Black student that comes to you for help. And they don't want to be that problem student that's always noting that all the other students are not treating him well, or that you might have said something that was microaggressive to them. So they just want to just do their work. So they don't always come to seek help when they need. And so this kind of information really kind of shocked me as we were doing our studies. And it's not just this one student, this is systemic. So a broad range of students will say these kinds of things at these interviews with Lynn Gaisley. So it's really interesting to see what the student perspectives in there. So based on all the research that we've been doing, we've developed this theory of change for us. And we believe at TC&J, we've been achieving this kind of change. We have seen dramatic changes in our department and in our classes. We think about our theory change in three different pillars of that help to build our change process. So our first pillar that we work with is gaining an empathy and understanding of our student. And the real word that's really important here is empathy. It's starting to feel what our students are feeling in their different situations, and understanding why they make the choices that they do. And this is where our qualitative research really powerful in helping us understand it. So part of gaining this empathy is that we have to have a lot of data. So I can show you data after data after data that shows that our Black and Latinx students are not doing so well. We can break it down by SAT scores. And all of our faculty look at this and they're like, wow, I'm really concerned about that. But does it actually make a change in what people do in their practices? So this tells us what is wrong, but it doesn't tell us how it's wrong. So we don't always quite understand it. And that's the power of collaborating with our sociologists. So we can now understand how our students are actually failing and succeeding in our classes. So we started a project a while ago where we work with our students of color. And in New Jersey, our students of color typically come from low-income zip codes. So they typically come from high schools that are under-resourced. They don't have quite as good math courses and very few AP classes. So that is the landscape for TC&J, is that there is a systemic issue. There's a relationship between income, high school preparation, and race, very closely tied together. And I think that's across the country in most situations. So we can go ahead and we studied a group of students. We have over 1,000 hours of interview that we did, and we started to understand what the students were going through. So this is one of the quotes that we have from our qualitative research. In high school, you just get by without studying, and blah, blah, blah. I was like, okay, that's not me. That's not me. Right. Then I failed this quiz and I was like, oh, snap, that was me. So for this student, they actually never had to study in high school, ever, because they came from one of these high schools where they were number one. They graduated number one from their high school. They never had to pick up a book to study. And every time an instructor told them, oh, you got to study or you got to change, college is different. That was all heard with, like, when we're thinking about the Peanuts and Charlie Brown, all they heard was wah, 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 wah. They didn't hear anything about the advice that we're giving until they experience failure. And there's been a lot of people that have written about this. We call this experience grade shock. So this happens quite a bit. And what is a student's response to this first failure? Or this first failure? And we all know students who go through this. A lot of students will just kind of flee. So they will disappear. You will never see them again. All right. So, and that's pretty, that's pretty systemic. We see a lot of students that do that. However, what our qualitative research noticed some other trends of students that succeed from this. So a student who sat there and said, like, I really got to study if I want to pass this class. We call it the power of studying. But this is systemic. The students that actually were able to recognize there's an issue with them and it's related to studying, instead of blaming other issues that are going around. And what's even more powerful is for all the students that actually started succeeding after this grade shock experience, they went through something like this. If I didn't do as well on an exam, I might try something different. And that was for every single student that made a change, that actually started succeeding in our summer program where we were doing this testing in there, is that they actually recognized that grades were linked to studying, and they actually had to make a change in their study habits. So it wasn't just about, oh, let's go do these things more. Let's go ahead and do something differently and kind of through that. So understanding this and how do you adapt to grade shock, let us know that we could build this into our classrooms and build these experiences if we start to assume that none of our students have had to really study in high school when they get to our classes. So this comes to our second pillar, and we call this experimentalist teaching in here. And, most of us are scientists in here. I think just about everybody's a scientist or an engineer. We're always trying to optimize what we're trying to do. We're trying to better in our classrooms, but let's treat our classrooms like an experiment. And I know the Viper community actually already does a lot of this. So Abby and I learned a lot from the Viper community on how to try different things and do some active learning. So what we started to do is treat our general chemistry classroom like an experiment. We started working through it. We started thinking about things like cause and effects. And I'm a chemist, and most of us are chemists or have been trained in some sort of chemistry in here. We're always thinking about the mechanisms of what the cause and effects is actually. So how and why does that work? And then when we think about our student success strategies, what kind of interventions can we actually put into the mechanism so that we can change the effects, so we can find a new thermodynamic minimum for our students? So just kind of shifting it around, playing a bit with our kinetics of our studying and looking at it is one of the things we can try to do. But designing interventions is something that I really enjoy thinking about and doing it. So let's go back and think about that grade shock experience. So maybe the cause of it is that the student doesn't reflect on their learning. And the mechanism is because they never had to. They got A's on everything. They could walk into it, or they could just study for 30 minutes before one of their assignments and get an A on it. So it didn't take a lot. So they never had to think about it. And we want them to develop better coping skills to think about their reflection of their learning. So we can design and force our students or put into practice our students some of the interventions we design. So we do things like making our activities very explicit, what our expectations are. And then we do a lot of metacognitive activities. So we think of things like post-exam and quiz reflections. We always have conversations in the classroom after quizzes and exams. So we're really focusing on getting the students to think about how they learn. So learning how they learn. is very important on here. So we do this in our classrooms, and if anybody would walk into one of our Gen Chem classrooms, it would look just simply like a flipped classroom. So however, our classroom is much more complex because we are designing interventions in there. I consider flipped classroom to be a technique in there, but it's not an intervention itself. So we call our classroom a high structured guided practice classroom. So we have high structure because we have lots of explicit activities that they need to do to be successful. And we also try to create a practice space for students. So remember, we have a grade shock experience. It's a safe space to fail. And we want them to fail and recover from it and develop the mechanisms to recover from the failure on here. And we do this quite a bit. So we do this a lot through active learning. So I'm really thankful that Viper is so big on active learning.
Join the meeting.
But we also have a lot of fundamental skill building that we often ignore in a first year chemistry class. So we don't assume that they have study skills. We don't assume that they've ever done any type of metacognition. We also assume that they haven't developed any resilience skills for the classrooms. We make sure our classrooms are culture responsive, and that's particularly important for the students of color and our queer students. So making sure we understand the backgrounds and the challenges that they have. And the last thing we do is a lot of assessment alignment, and that's been where Viper has been really powerful in terms of thinking about backwards design, thinking about our learning outcomes, making our assessments reflect our learning outcomes, and we design the right activities to reach those learning outcomes. So it is really important to do these kinds of activities in our T model on here. And last pillar, to actually change. So right now, a lot of that information about internal change, I can control all of those activities. I can get data about my students. I can make changes and experiment my class. But what we're really interested in is how do we get our whole faculty to change? So this is where we start to share our experiences regularly. And what we always do is we have both formal and informal ways of sharing. So we'll have we have a chat that we have, a Google chat that we will chat about our teaching strategies. We also dedicate department meetings to this pedagogy, and our science meetings are also dedicated to pedagogy and teaching. So some of the data that we share to help move conversation is data on our classes. So this is our general chemistry. We were able to do the HSGP classroom in all of our sections in all of 2019, we had a test section of 3-section HSGP, and then the other 6 sessions were all traditional classrooms. So same semester, we all did this. In a traditional classroom, we can see that the Black and Latinx students get a D, F, or W at higher rates than our white students. And we have Pell eligible students. Those are the low income students. That was our breakdown for the numbers. We can see there's a very big difference in performance of those students. And so when we start to look at our HSGP classrooms, we start to get data like this. It helps to support all of our students, and in particular, it really helps the Black and the Latinx students. So this is really important because this is the only time that I am okay with racial erasure. So this is the first time that I am okay with not being able to predict what a student is going to perform, whether they're going to get a D, F, or a W based on the color of their skin. So this is really important for us to move forward. And this kind of data and this presentation of what we're trying to do was really important to get all of our faculty on board to do this. And we've actually unleashed this HSGP in all of our classrooms in the middle of a pandemic. So we are doing all of our classes. We are reforming the entire Gen Chem 1 and 2 curriculums to follow this kind of HSGP model, and we're going to continue this. So we saw a great faculty culture shift. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Abby, and she's going to show us how this has applied to inorganic over the last few years.
Thanks, Benny. Next slide.
So as Benny has laid the groundwork for the stuff that we've been working on at TCNJ, I've been teaching inorganic chemistry at TCNJ since I started more than 10 years ago. And so Benny and I have been alternating teaching this class for 10 years. And so we've been trying to find better strategies to engage all the students. And a lot of this stuff, as Benny said initially, we went to the Viper workshops, learned a lot about active learning and using learning objects in the classroom, as well as looking at learning objectives. But over the last couple of years, we've really started to think about, how can we change the structure in our classrooms so that they're inclusive for all students. Because I was still seeing this big gap between students of color and the white students in my classes. And so I got involved in teaching in a summer bridge program that we have at TCNJ many years ago. And that started off these grassroots conversations. And so if you're looking at our little scheme here, this is from our book chapter. We started just having grassroots discussions about, how can we improve our teaching and how can we improve student engagement? And then we started realizing that, we could mentor one another about experiences that we've had in the classroom. And over the last 10 years, we've had a very big change in the hires in our department. So we're now a very young new faculty, very interested in different teaching pedagogies. And so we've been starting to think about, more in terms of experimental teaching. And so for us as teachers, this only works if you get buy-in from your students. And so the next part of our catalytic cycle is picking up the students. And so we're thinking about, how can we engage students? And what we've found that works particularly well is collecting feedback and actually using the feedback to make change. And so this is where that experimental teaching comes into play. What changes can we make to improve the classroom and the learning experience? And I'll talk about how I've done this in the inorganic chemistry curriculum in a minute. In addition, in order for us to do all this work, we need administration to help support our endeavors because it is a ton of work. So at TCNJ, we have very supportive administration at the dean and now provost and presidential level. Our faculty standards for promotion and tenure support experimental teaching. So that's kind of nice. I know a lot of institutions don't do that, but we encourage you to, try to get that into your tenure and promotion documents, and also to offer incentives for people to be more experimental in their teaching. And then also in thinking about helping us along, like we said initially when we did this stuff, we didn't have financial means to support this, but over the years we've had many programmatic grants to help secure grants. In addition, we have a School of Science grant writer who helps develop and write some of these programmatic grants to help support that. In addition, our administration has workshops and things that we can attend. We had several years ago a Summer Institute for Inclusive Excellence in Teaching and Learning. We're having a virtual one again in this summer, specifically focusing on science classes in the TCNJ world. So these are some things that you can start thinking about in terms of modifying your classroom. Next slide, Benny. But in particular, what we're interested in talking to you about today is how we've gone through this experimentation over the last 10 years. So to give you a little bit of context about TCNJ and the inorganic chemistry curriculum, students only need to take one semester of inorganic chemistry. We are an ACS certified program. All students in our curriculum tend to be junior and senior chemistry majors. And we have a very diverse population of students. We are a public institution in New Jersey. So over the last couple of classes, we've seen an increase in the number of Black and Latinx students from maybe 5% to 25 to 30%. So, we're talking about a quarter of our class here. And since we are an undergraduate institution, you probably see 30 students in an inorganic chemistry class at a 400 level, and you're like, wow, that's a lot. Yeah, we have a lot of chemistry majors here. And so, yeah, we have a good population, which means they're quite diverse. Since we have a good sized faculty, we actually have 3 inorganic chemists. So myself, Benny, and we just hired Levi Eckinger, who's a bio-inorganic chemist by training. And so we are very broadly trained. We have, wide expertise and different teaching styles that we've been working through. And so over the last 10 years, Benny and I have been constantly adjusting the curriculum and our approaches. And again, we started with using the pedagogies on the Viper website to, start thinking about how we can incorporate active learning into the classroom, moving away from more traditional lectures and learning from the literature in different ways. In addition, we've done a huge amount of work in the lab, making it more research-based, embedding cures and things like that. And so, over the last 10 years, we saw great improvements in interest in organic chemistry and retention in the major and graduation rates, et cetera. But again, we still had this constant thing in the back of our minds, like there's still this gap, and we wanted to try to lower decrease the gap between our white and our Black students. And I specifically wanted to do that in the context of my inorganic chemistry course that I taught this past semester. On top of that, it was remote, so it was particularly challenging. So I'm going to talk to you today about what I've done to create a high structure classroom in a remote setting. Next slide. Okay, so just to kind of reiterate what our high structure guided practice model, it involved an active learning space, fundamental skill building, a culturally responsive classroom, and assessment alignment. So I'm going to try to tell you about what I've done in inorganic chemistry last semester. Next slide. So this is just a picture of my LMS. It's kind of small for you all to see, but there's a picture of me not as a chemist. So you see my identity is besides chemistry. I'm at the beach. Everything is linked out to stuff so that it's very accessible to all students. In addition, there's links to different ways of access for me. You can contact me by email. You can contact me through GroupMe. You can contact me through Zoom. And then there's little buttons in here that connect you to all the different portfolios for our class. So next. So the first thing I wanted to do is talk about strategies to break down barriers in your classroom and think about creating an even more inclusive active learning space. Next. All right, so in order to create an inclusive classroom, things that I do, you really have to think about making the classroom culture a place where people want to share their experiences. And so for me, when I start my class, I lay out all of my identities, what the student should call me, what my pronouns are, so that everyone can start to feel comfortable about sharing some things about them. I also share, my trajectory to getting to where I am. I am a first generation student, so I know that feeling for many of my students. I also know what it's like to be in a family of non-scientists. So, I talk specifically about that. I also talk about how it's okay to leave New Jersey and come back, and, the students really connect with that. And so right from the get-go, students know who I am. They feel comfortable, and that builds a community in my classroom. I also let the students interact in different ways, through the chat, through GroupMe, whatever, through the LMS. I just have lots of constant feedback to them. In addition, through any assessment, any assignment, they're always asked to provide feedback. What was good about this? What was bad about it? And I make incremental changes so that the next time it seems to be a little bit better for them. Other things that I do, we talk about struggles, and it's not just struggles in this specific class, it's struggles campus-wide. What are our successes? We always talk about failure, but what does a success look like to us? And so those things are things that have broken down barriers in my classroom and gotten people to participate more. So next. The next thing that I want to talk about are some of the activities that we do. So this is an active learning space. And so in an active learning space, you obviously have to have activities. So many of the activities that I've done are activities from Viper. And so what I did was I took a lot of these and put them into a virtual environment on Jamboards and Google Docs so that students could collaborate remotely. It worked out quite well. In addition, I had developed a lot of other learning activities. And during the classroom synchronous sessions, students would actually be doing these activities for most of the class period. And what I found was most rewarding for students, and when we get to the comments at the end, is that all of the questions that I developed are from articles. And so they really appreciate, developing questions that are challenging and also have content. And the reason that I developed these questions the way that I do is because when I think about the assessment, I want the students to have seen the question several times in different flavors so that they have a better feeling and are less anxious when they actually get to the exam. And so you'll see in the next section that the way that I've designed this in terms of the flipped classroom is all of the content delivery is by videos, 45 minutes broken up into several segments. And then there's a pre-class assignment of questions of slightly easier rigor, but they're directly related to the content that I want them to be able to obtain from the videos. And then the in-class questions are, a step up. The post-class questions are a step up. And then the assessment questions are aligned with the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy that I think that the students should be able to do. Next. And so what about the labs? So at TCNJ, lab is part of this class. And so, in terms of skill building, we've really broken apart the lab in thinking about this in terms of backwards design. What are the skills that the student should be able to get from the inorganic chemistry curriculum? And we started to recognize that not all of our majors were able to get research experience. We know at other institutions that's often part of the curriculum and required for all chemistry majors. It is not at TCNJ, depends on your track. But we see the value in developing research skills. And so Benny and I went and developed a cure style lab and thought about how we could use ligand design and screening reactions in the lab to get people acclimated to developing research style proposals for projects versus a standard set of experiments. So all of our labs are project based and scaffold skills, require literature and things like that. Next slide. So in terms of metacognition and study skills, next please. When I think about this in terms of a faculty member, I'm always thinking about preparing the students for life past TCNJ, for other courses in our curriculum, and to be lifelong learners. So some of our outcomes next in terms of having these active learning and skill building and thinking about resiliency is like I said, we've always seen an interest in inorganic chemistry after they've taken our class. So in 2017 and 2018, when I taught this last, I was always doing active learning things, but I wasn't using this high structure guided practice model that involved, practice at all levels, these videos, more of me, that inclusive classroom feel. But once I moved to the, this inclusive classroom feeling, these more structure and guided practice, I saw an even more increase in interest in inorganic chemistry, up to 55%. So I think, just adding in that last layer really improved things. We also see increased interest in obtaining advanced degrees in inorganic chemistry, areas that apply inorganic chemistry. And this thing at the last point I want to stress here is that on my feedback forms for my students this semester, what I noticed was that all students finally got something valuable out of the class, which I've never seen before. And so I was very happy to see that even the student that hates this class got something out of it. Next slide. And so for me, generating a culturally responsive classroom probably was the hardest thing to think about because, you got to get out of your comfort zone. You got to get out of your shell. You got to be willing to share with the students and have them tell you things that you may not be comfortable with. And so next, please. some things that I can say to you is no two students in your class are going to be on the same journey. And so recognizing that not every student has exactly the same access to everything in life was very important. And once I did that and recognized that some students may need something more than others, life got a lot better for all of my students in the classroom. Being appreciative of every student's differences, cultures, identities. I've worked with students in wheelchairs. I've worked with, students of all different colors and cultures and identities. And just being appreciative of all the little talents that everyone brings to the classroom. Something else that I found to be very important is, oftentimes when we teach these upper level courses, we assume they come in with a lot of knowledge and that it's good. This is not a safe assumption. And, bringing in just-in-time teaching is important at all levels of the curriculum. And I can encourage you to think about that as well. What I've started doing on my assessments and literature assignments is starting to think about representing articles from underrepresented scientists. Students really appreciate that, and giving them a little bit of a story about someone that might be more like them that they don't often highlight in the curriculum. And generally, if you express interest in what your students are doing, whether it's in the classroom or out, they often connect with you better and are more responsive to your style. Next. So how did I align my assessment? So this is the last point of our high structured, high guided practice model. The first thing I did was I moved all of my content out of the classroom. So I use all lecture videos. So more of the flip style classroom. They're interactive. There were breaks in them. There was problems for them to work through. And in the beginning, the students really were, they thought it was a lot. But after they got into the groove of it, it made a lot more sense to them why I had done this way. And that's because in the classroom, we developed explicit learning objectives. And I do this with my students, actually. They come up with what they're supposed to do. And then the reason why I think that this is exceptionally important is the students become vested in the learning process. They now know what it is that they have to do. And then they can use these as cues for studying. And cues are very important. As Benny said, we want to be very explicit about about what we want the students to be able to do. And if they're writing that, then they should be able to do it. Practice and allow for safe failure. So, as scientists, we fail at experiments all the time. This is a pathway to a PhD, right? You got to fail many experiments to get to the end. Students often don't realize that. As Benny said, they come in, they're the top student in their class. They don't have a place to fail. And so we provide this by having practice space and making sure that we have lots of low stakes assessment so that they can make mistakes and then feel more confident going into the assessment. Reflection, post-class reflection, that's also practicing problems, but also recognizing problems with their group work. And so oftentimes they work in groups, they may make a mistake, they go back and reflect and make sure that they know how to answer the question. And so in terms of assessments, I moved to a group assessment model for my class. Part of it, I should say, because some of it, I still need to have some kind of individual component. But this worked really well for very, very challenging questions where the students, could debate something, come up with the final answer, and then provide, what their rationale was. So that worked out quite well. And then 100% of my students noticed that my course is directly aligned with what my expectations were. And so in terms of grades, my average grade this semester was an 89%, significantly higher than what I had before. But the other thing that I didn't notice, which I had noticed before, was that there was no difference based on color. And I erased the same thing that Benny saw in the general chemistry curriculum, that I couldn't tell you who my Black students were or my Latinx students. They were all the same. Next slide. And so the next is a series of comments. I'm not going to read them all. There's next. But you can see how our high structured, high classroom model highlights what students were saying. Feedback gave me confidence to keep going and do my best. It also allowed me a safe place to ask questions. So people felt comfortable to ask questions when they needed help. Giving people an equal shot of success. This was the first time they ever felt that in our curriculum. One more comment, the videos and the practice space, working with classmates really helped their learning. And the last one, frequent check-ins gave the students a chance to provide something and allow me to change my curriculum and my teaching methods so that they would do better. So next, please. The last thing is stuff that I'm willing to share. All of it, content, syllabus, assessments, problem sets. If you want some of this content, please ask me. I'm more than happy to share things with anyone that needs it. And I'm currently working with Anthony on sharing some of these things through Viper. Next. So I know that we had a lot to say, so we have to thank all the people that have helped us throughout our time here. There are a lot of people here, but Lynn Gaisley, especially in our sociology department, really guiding and framing what we're doing in the School of Science. It takes a village to make change like this, and these are some of the people that have helped us get there. And so with that, we'll stop and take any questions that you might have.
Mitch, go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm also at the same time trying to figure out how to like switch between the 3 different cameras I got on my computer here. Okay, cool. Are we good? Thanks a lot for this. Can you clarify for me if high structure guided practice includes the components of inclusivity, like how you were presenting yourself, showing your identities? Is that a part of high structure guided practice? Or is that a layer on top of a pedagogy? I think, Benny, you had mentioned about how you thought flipped classroom was a pedagogy, not an intervention. And I'm wondering if you would, if there was a similar distinction between those two ideas.
Yeah, I think for me, the culturally responsive classroom is part of creating an inclusive base in there. And if we want students to succeed, there is a lot of inclusion that can happen. We call it high structure guided practice because not all the faculty members are comfortable with that inclusivity piece for various reasons. So that's why I think it's a very, very important piece of what we are doing, but not everybody is comfortable doing that. So the high structure guided practice, if you create this high structure classroom, a safe space to fail, we're finding out that, like adjuncts that are not as well versed in all the diversity, equity, inclusion language can still have very good results with this without, as long as they're a decent person and they don't say anything nasty to students. So, I think it's a layer of it, and I think the students really appreciate it, and it does make a huge difference in there.
I think too, like the reason we moved to the flipped style was just to free up space in the synchronous time when we're meeting students, so that we can do these types of conversations. We're always pressed for time in our curriculum. We're cutting things all the time. And so now if we, figure out the key content and, whether that's lecturing in person or not, we know what content is, really, really critical, but we can cut out the things that are less critical and focus on, these conversations so that it makes things a little bit better.
All right, so Shirley had her hand up.
Thanks, Abby and Benny, for a great talk. And my question has to do with, it sounds like your outcomes were so positive and a huge impact, and it's great to see that. Tell us a little bit about what didn't work well. What stumbling blocks, roadblocks you came across, both with other faculty and with students.
So for me, some of the stumble blocks, particularly in the general chemistry curriculum, is most of the students have never seen a classroom like this. So there's a lot of comments. Students don't really appreciate this. They don't feel like they're getting instruction. They're doing problem solving in classroom. That it's a challenge sometimes. But I think once they started to see the alignment of the problem solving activity. So if we think about a typical chemistry exam, it's almost all problem solving. There might be a few definitions on there, but the majority is problem solving. What do we end up doing in class? We end up talking to them all the definitions, and we expect them to do the hard part on their own. So just changing that around a little bit so that doing the hard part with the students, they complain, they see the first exam and see that, wow, that stuff has actually worked so far. So that was the biggest challenge. The other challenge is just buy-in from other faculty. It really took that data presentation for me to get every single instructor and have a departmental conversation to say, yes, this is what we are going to do for all geometry sections. And then the other challenge is also training adjuncts. So that's a huge challenge. And I was not 100% successful with the adjunct training last semester. It really does take connected adjuncts that really want to do this. So just because you put all the structure in, it doesn't always work. And essentially hand off an entire class to an adjunct. If they don't buy into it, it's a major challenge. Abby?
What I can say is, you know, expectations, like from the beginning, since I have been teaching this class for a long time, like I was like, oh, I got to get through all this content, blah, blah, blah. But then, you know, recognizing I can still get through, you know, good amount of content and have the same outcomes, but I could make the videos shorter. I could stress things differently. I could bring more animation into the videos, which students really appreciated. And so from the first set of videos to the second, you know, the constant feedback thing, really important. You know, what was positive, what was good about this, what was not good about it. And I took that and I did it and then saw how it went, fixed things around, did it again. You know, it's not 100% perfect, but that's also part of the learning thing for students to recognize that I'm not 100% perfect either. And I think once students saw that they, you know, they also could realize that it was a safe place to make mistakes. Other things that didn't work, number of questions for in-class work. Definitely have to really carefully think about the number of questions that you can complete, that the students can complete, that they, one thing I had to keep coming back to is I was running out of time to go over some of the content in the class. And so I'd have to spend the next period reviewing the questions with them. And so, you know, make time management always an issue. And if you go back to that, you know, figure that we were talking about, the student buy-in is very important. As Benny said, you know, a lot of students think that they're doing way more work, but the way that I've turned this around for my organic curriculum this semester, and we'll see how it goes, is that I'm telling them they're getting double the access of me. You know, they get me once through the videos and once in class to ask questions. And so that's twice the number of hours that they would normally have an organic chemistry professor for, which I think that they're going to buy into that a lot more because they feel like they never have contact with their professors in that class. So I think that, you know, getting the right spin for the students is also very important.
All right, we had Matthew up next with his hand raised.
Thank you. Benny and Abby, thank you both. This is really a very cool conversation. One of the things that really stuck out to me, Abby, was that you pointed out the high level of success that your students have, you know, that high B+ average that you're able to achieve in that class. And I'd like to think that in my kind of science adjacent department and the engineering and technology focused classes I teach, I'd like to think that I use some of the model that you're talking about in a much less sophisticated way than what you're articulating, but you know, the spirit of it. And one of the things that I've often kind of, you know, just been impressed by is that I can almost guarantee a group of students at the beginning of the semester, if you want it, you could get an A or a B in this class. The structure is there. I know each of you are competent and capable of doing it. And by and large, if they want to get an A or a B, a quality grade, they can. How do you counter the perception that maybe others might have, the ones who don't buy in, that somehow you have diminished the quality because too many people are being successful? Because I know that's a thought that percolates around out there, and I'm always kind of on the ready to defend it. How do you convince people that you're still giving the rigor if so many students are doing so much better than others expect them to?
So I'm asking the same exam questions that I've asked. Like, that's how I developed my questions. Actually, I took a lot of them from past exams and problem sets, and they're doing way better on them than they ever did before. And that's, I think, because they're practicing them ahead of time. And then I'm asking them a similar question from a different application. And so I would say the rigor and the style of questions is exactly the same. It's just that I'm being much more explicit in their ability to practice than I ever was before. Like, I would give them my old exams. I would give them, example problems to do, but it was on the student whether they were going to do it or not. Now they don't have a choice, right? They have to do it during class. And, I give credit for them participating in class. It's not a lot, but they have to participate. And then they have to do the post-class reflection. And then that's graded for accuracy. And so, yeah, the other thing that is challenging about this is time, because you do spend an absolute ton of time grading. And that's, I think, a big barrier for our department in terms of moving this forward in other classes, especially organic chemistry, is, how do you grade all of those assignments? And so, general chemistry probably Benny can probably give you some more feedback on that. But I think rigor-wise, I would say that the class is nearly as rigorous as it was before. It's just that I'm being much more explicit on the practice space and students' ability to practice.
Right, and I can also add on there, our department has been very good on outcomes-based discussions. So like in our physical chemistry class, Don Hirsch was our first faculty member that used learning goals and learning outcomes. And that was critical to have that conversation earlier, that if all the students meet all the learning outcomes, it's perfectly fine that you give out lots of A's. So, that's the piece, is determining your outcomes. And I still remember the talk Joanne Stewart gave about reverse design. That was the first time assessment ever made sense to me on there. So when she talked about assessment and figuring out your outcomes first and designing the class around that is what we should be doing. So that's how we've been countering those arguments. So, and I saw Carrie typed in the same thing from her dean. So if you determine the outcomes first, that's what you want the students to hit. If the students hit it, they hit it.
And for Matt, like, we had a conversation in the college, in the School of Science, actually, about building these right into the LMS so that, everyone knows what this class should be. And if a student can do those things and you can put it right into to Canvas or whatever, then that's what an A equals. This is what a B equals. And so that's kind of what I've been doing too with the learning outcomes.
All right, we have Amanda, her hand is up.
Hey everybody, thanks for the talk. I have a comment and two questions. I'll try and make this fast. The first is that this fall I ended up switching to a flipped classroom for Gen Chem, and thanks to Benny for some good conversations before the semester started. And I've actually been floored at how much the students have liked it and told me they really appreciated it. So just as a word for people that are thinking about it. But to Abby's point about the extra grading, I actually don't give them any credit whatsoever for any of the in-class work. I just state that that's what we're doing in class and that's the expectation, and they still come and do it. So I don't know how much you have to give that sort of carrot or stick for the classroom activities always to make that happen. So I'll just throw that out there. My questions were, compared to the Gen Chem sort of DFW rates, were you seeing similar rates at that inorganic level? Because we've kind of had this, if the Gen Chem is unfortunately that weed out course or they're not making it there, are you still seeing dramatic differences in those rates even at those higher level courses? And then my second question is, we often hear about the importance and the role of some of these metacognition and the study skills. And as you all were talking about, it's already so hard to get in the content and the practice time, and we all feel behind. So how do you balance time in the classroom for those activities?
You want to start off, Abby?
Yeah, so that's actually a good question, because Benny and I talked about that yesterday when we were talking about this talk, about the fact that in our inorganic curriculum, we don't have the DFW rates that we have in the general chemistry and organic. I mean, Gen Chem is one thing, organic is a very different one, and it's way worse. And so that's where I'm working right now to try to tackle that. But we very rarely give D's and F's in inorganic. It's like basically if you don't come to class and don't hand stuff in, then you're going to fail, because you can at least get a C. But what I can say is I did have students before that have gotten D's in inorganic chemistry. And that's just basically because they demonstrated no knowledge whatsoever, on the final, on projects, whatever it was. Like, if I'm just looking at my learning outcomes, I did not see that at all. What I saw in the final on the assessments and things, I could say in good faith that the student got B level knowledge and not D level, demonstrating D level knowledge.
All
Yeah,
right.
and I can just add on to that. The DFW rate is just one measure. Another measure that we're starting to work on is what we call thriving, surviving, and leaving. So what the general feel of a survivor, thriver, somebody who's thriving in a class, they're usually like the A, B+ student. Somebody who's surviving is that C, B to C kind of group. And the leavers are typically the people that are not doing so hot. So once you get to something like inorganic, I think using that kind of model to think about your students and who's thriving in the class and surviving, just barely making it through, and then who's actually failing, is actually a better kind of measure.
All right, Chip, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just really quick, and I think I know the answer to this. More focused Gen Chem. Do you then give them like assigned problems to do on their own, or use a system of graded homework or anything at all? Or
Yes, we actually do. So we have pre-class assignments, and the pre-class assignment is the videos, reading, and they have to take a quiz. They also have to submit notes on their reading. So if you don't, or submit notes on their videos, you don't require them to watch the videos. They don't seem to do that. And I know our organic chemistry, we have commented on that. Just make them do an assignment on that. And then in class, they do problem solving, and afterwards we use Chem 101 to do all of our assignments now. We also do for in-class assignments. It's actually a very beautiful system for this remote world. I totally recommend Chem 101 in there. The only thing we haven't done to the Gen Chem is revise our lab curriculum, which needs a lot of help. So our lab curriculum I put off to the side for now, but we have hopefully some exciting kind of things that are going to come out. So we haven't touched the lab yet, but we're definitely working on that piece.
let me follow that up and then say that there's a question in the chat that you should address too. So if you have them turn in notes, how similar looking are they? If you catch my drift.
Yeah, so they're we expect mostly handwritten notes, so you can tell by the handwriting. Yeah, I mean, the students could copy from each other their notes, and you know what, that if they copy from each other and they are passing my class and doing well, I don't really care. But if they're failing the class, then there's a problem. So I can't monitor all of that in there. So yeah, we have had some Chegg issues. Everybody else this past
Everyone
fall.
does.
Yeah. Oh, and somebody asked, Mitch, I think you asked about Chem 101. It is not a free source. So we use an open source textbook. So OpenStax, Adams, first, second edition, and Chem 101 links to that. Chem 101, I think it's $25 a semester, which is still cheaper than our textbook that we used to have. So $50 for the year.
All right, do we have any other questions? Well, then, because I hosted this, I get to ask a question too. So I'll ask one question. One thing I was struck by in the beginning of your talk was those comments made by students in the qualitative research, and the one that's I don't want to be the person that is the problem, so I just keep my mouth shut, right? Or that there was also something about how I failed and, you know, I can't do this. Maybe I'm reading into this, but I was struck by how, do you have any resources, or do you bring anything like having to do with mindsets into the classroom? Because to me, that was like a mindset issue. Like, if you believe you can do it, you're going to do it, you know, and ways that you can just, you know, flip that script.
Yeah, so the mindset thing is very challenging, particularly for our students of color, because they're fighting 200 years of racial injustice in there. So, you know, if you're a Black student in there, you know, for this example, the Black student that made that comment had grown up in a predominantly white atmosphere and essentially got paid for everything he did. And the teachers would blame him for any kind of ruckus that would happen in the classroom. So, you know, if you're in that atmosphere constantly, you're going to come to college, it's still currently white. You're still expecting that was happening, that students would try to get this to pop off. That's his words, pop off. And then it would still happen that the professor will look at the Black student and said, what's going on here? Not at all the students that were around them. So you are also fighting the racial issues, and it's not just a mindset thing there. And that's really hard to, you know, and get students to move on from that. So by giving them lots of structure that's already built in, you know, we also talk about group design, thinking about how you design groups. There's no one best way to do it. Having a toolkit of different ways of assigning groups matters quite a bit, because a lot of us do things like think, pair, share. One of the things that came out of the interview is that this student would be like, the white guy next to me turned to his left, the other guy, the other to my other side turned to their side. So it wasn't think, pair, share. It was just think for me, because nobody turned to me in there. So, you know, things like think, pair, share, you have to be very cognizant about what's happening in your classroom, how things like race or difference is impact those kinds of activities, which we know are super effective. We know think, pair, share is very effective, but what if nobody turns to them and think about that? So that's a major challenge. You're fighting lots of different things, particularly for the students of color.
All right, do we have any other questions for Benny and Abby? Okay, well, thank you, Benny and Abby, for your talk. It was wonderful to hear what you guys have done at the College of New Jersey. Do we clap out loud, or do we have to do the emoji? I don't know. All right, thank you everybody for coming. This is a wonderful discussion. Hopefully we can continue these discussions, you know, throughout the year and beyond.